right, in this fourth session of week 10, we will talk about the interesting agro business carried out by Goryeo saram since 1960s in the Soviet Union. And Goryeo saram call it Kobonjil. But no one knows the origin of the word Kobonjil, but that's what they say. And it literally means truck farming or market gardening, large-scale market gardening. And how it happened? Let's look at it. Now, Goryeo saram didn't, in Central Asia, they didn't have any freedom to move. So they had to be confined in collective farm. The children had to go to schools in collective farm, and adults, when they want to study, go to university, they could not go because they were not allowed to travel. And however, this would change after the death of Stalin. That happened in 1953. Stalin's death meant a lot. In Korea, real Korea now, Stalin's death finished the Korean War. The Korean War began with Kim Il-sung and Stalin, but when Stalin died, North Korea signed the truce, the end of the war. And here in Central Asia and Soviet Union, also people felt they were freer than before. And the same here in Korean communities in Central Asia, they were given more freedom. So from that time on, they could go to school outside of their zone. So Koreans began to go to school in Moscow and other cities. That's happened only after Stalin's death. And as I said, Korean collective farms were the most productive collective farms in the entire Soviet Union. And here in the image, you see that in Korean collective farm that grows rice, and the managers are checking the quality of rice and so on. And that was sometime in 1960s. And the reason why Korean farms were so productive was, first of all, Koreans are expert in growing rice. And they were the ones who succeeded in growing rice in Manchuria and even Siberia. And they also had a goal to prove their loyalty to the Soviet Union. And any ethnic minority in multicultural society, if you can prove your loyalty, that means your social and political power goes up. And that's exactly what happened to Japanese Americans during the Second World War. We already covered this and when we were talking about Korean Americans, but Japanese Americans, they were captured and they were interned in desert areas of inland, in Nevada and so on. And that's because they were suspected by American government and Americans. So they had to prove their loyalty, and they volunteered to participate in the Second World War as an American soldiers, and they were sent to Europe. And after the war, because of their heroic battles and contribution in the war, they were elected as politicians and so on. So that is normal pattern that ethnic minorities, when you are suspected, you have a hard time. But when you prove your worth to the greater society, then your social status goes up. And Koreans had that goal. And that's why they worked very hard and their farms were way, way more productive. However, the changes came. In the Soviet Union, the collectivization happened in late 1920s when Stalin gained power, but then this collective farm system continuously changed. In what way? It became bigger and bigger. That means in Central Asia, for Korean collective farm, what it means was when Koreans were working together as one farm, it worked very well. But now, collective farm was, different collective farms became one by force. And now suddenly you have to work with Uzbeks and Chechens and Germans and Poles, all kinds of people. And because Korean farms were so productive, many farms wanted to be attached to Korean farm. Now, in general, the productivity went down. And many Koreans who have been working very hard until that point, they felt a little bit of disenchanted. And they would leave. But anyway, in this photo, you see that a multiracial collective farm in Uzbekistan in 1980s, and you see at the center you see Korean, and then on the back you have some Central Asians and also Europeans, Russians possibly, and Germans and so on. So all this different, it's a beautiful, the multicultural. But as far as the productivity was concerned at that time, productivity went down as collective farm became larger and larger. And eventually, that is one reason why Soviet Union collapsed. Anyway, the Koreans who didn't want to work hard now in a new collective farm, they left and they would do something amazing. Now, they would gather other Koreans and their families and make a big group, and they would contact different collective farm to rent their land. So collective farm is a huge, and often it has tens of thousands of people with hundreds of acres. And so these Koreans, organized Koreans, as a cooperative, they would rent small portion of land, normally 1% or 2% of the entire collective farm, and they choose best land. And then they promise the collective farm that they will pay 100% of their tax to the government. And they also pay money. So from collective farms perspective, there's no reason why you say no. Because as a collective farm, you have to pay quite a bit of a tax to the government. And now these Koreans, working on only 1% of their land, they promise that they will cover 100% of the tax. That's already great. Because that means 90-something% of their products now, they don't need to worry about tax. It's all theirs. So, in a sense, this illegal, things happen, and often with the bribery and, as I said, tax. Now, what Koreans did in this was like this. They would choose their own crop, cash crop, which they can make money. And these cash crops normally included watermelons and especially onions. And Koreans were, at that time, were known as onion growers. And rice often, and so on. And here, a chili pepper, because Koreans are the expert of chili pepper, of course. And so entire family, often like in this image on the left, I know the family, and the family gave me this photo, by the way. And entire family, during summer, they all have a job. Because the former Soviet Union, everyone has a job. But the system doesn't really work, and they can take a long holiday if they wish, by paying bribery, whatever. And they would come to a farm, and in this case, the family And with another family here and there, they would grow rice or grow some chili pepper or eggplant or cucumber, onions, and so on. And then when they harvest, they will carry their products to big cities like Moscow or Leningrad, which is St. Petersburg today, and other cities, Novosibirsk or Odessa in Ukraine, and Kiev, and they would sell them. So that's what Kobonjil is. Now, this brought a lot of social changes to Korean community, but also to the entire Soviet economy, often, because now they grow cash crops, and they have to carry their products, and normally where they choose the land is southern Ukraine and southern Russia, where the climate is good, and often also in Uzbekistan. And that is why even today in southern Ukraine there are Koreans living, and many of them were allowed to come to South Korea because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But anyway, that is a reason why Koreans were there. And they would seasonally migrate from Uzbekistan or from Kazakhstan, wherever they live. They would go to southern Russia and southern Ukraine, and then after they harvest, and they will come back. Now, this gave them experience of almost like an international trade. Because even though Soviet Union is one country, it is actually federation of many republics. So crossing this border, they would learn how to cross the border and how to deal with the local policemen, local government officials, and so on and so on. And so some Koreans became quite wealthy. Of course, being wealthy in the former Soviet Union really doesn't mean too much, because there was you can't buy BMWs and you can't enjoy Chanel bags and so on and so on, Gucci or whatever. But that made many Koreans wealthy, and also it gave them management skills, because they had to hire local people during the harvest season. So it gave some Koryo saram management skills and international idea of international trade. In our next session, we will talk about the globalizing Korean food within the Soviet Union by this Koryo saram.